The Bible is indeed an amazing book. Its depth of subject, the very subject it touches on, is the most amazing subject, isn't it? The spiritual things that otherwise we would have no knowledge of except the things that are written in that Word. And it is such a beautiful book. The expressions in the Bible, so much of it is almost like reading poetry to read the way it's presented. And it touches on so many subjects that just naturally fit into the story that is told. And so today we're going to go into Africa in the study of the Scriptures. I think it's interesting how that when you look at the land of Israel, it's a very small and narrow piece of land with the Mediterranean Sea out to one side, and then you've got the deserts out on the other side. And it's hard to travel through the deserts, and it's difficult on the sea, but it's like a little land bridge. And it's right there where all of the European countries, and then all of the Asian countries, and all of the African countries, it's right in the middle of that. It's just like kind of like the little link, that little narrow strip that all of it goes together. It's like the world, to communicate with each other, they have to go through the land of Israel. What a wonderful place for our Savior to come to this earth and to preach a gospel that from there would go into all the world. And so we're going to talk about Ethiopia. I didn't really plan this on the fact that this is Black History Month. February in our schools, they remember this is Black History Month. And it's a month they kind of set aside and said, let's remember our dark-skinned people of this world and think about the contributions they've made to history. It just kind of falls along the way we're going that this subject came up as this time as I try to spend about once a month in Isaiah. So here we are with a prophecy about Ethiopia, the land shadowing with wings. What's that talking about? Well, let's read Isaiah 18, and then we'll go into the Bible story about Ethiopia. And then we'll go into this text itself and try to understand what Isaiah the prophet, that about which the prophet is speaking. Well, let's go. Isaiah chapter 18. Woe to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, that sendeth ambassadors by the sea, even the vessels of bulrushes upon the waters, saying, Go ye swift messengers to a nation scattered and peeled, to a people terrible from their beginning hitherto, a nation meted out and trodden down, whose land the rivers have spoiled. All ye inhabitants of the world and dwellers on the earth, see ye when he lifteth up an ensign on the mountains, and when he bloweth the trumpet, hear ye. For so the Lord said unto me, I will take my rest, and I will consider in my dwelling place, like a clear heat upon the herbs, and like a cloud of dew in the heat of harvest. For the harvest, when the bud is perfect, and the sour grape is ripening in the flowers, he shall both cut off the sprigs with pruning hooks and take away and cut down the branches. They shall be left together unto the fowl of the mountains, and to the beast of the earth, and of the fowls shall summer upon them, and all the beasts of the earth shall winter upon them. In that time shall the present be brought unto the Lord of hosts, of a people scattered and peeled, and a people terrible from their beginning hitherto, a nation meted out and trodden underfoot, whose land the rivers have spoiled, to the place of the name of the Lord of hosts, the Mount Zion. Now, if you're like me, I've read that. I used to try to read the Bible every year. I did that for 25 years. I'd get into these prophets and I'd read these words and I'd think, something beautiful is being told here. Now what it is, I had trouble understanding and seeing it. Maybe you're like that. You understand. It's easy to see. There's something wonderful being told in these words. What is the message? And you know, poetry is like that sometimes. The meaning is obscure. And I think about that Ethiopian we read about in the New Testament when he was reading Isaiah, and Philip said, "Do you understand what you're reading?" He said, "How can I except some man guide me?" The beautiful words of that prophet intrigued him. And yet he's reading it without understanding. Well, Philip preached unto him Jesus. Well, let's see what these words Isaiah is talking about. First, let's talk about Ethiopia, though, and see its place in Bible studies. When we read about Ethiopia, let's see where it is. It's way up the river Nile, south of the land of Egypt, deep into Africa. In fact, in our text, it doesn't just talk about Ethiopia. It talks about the rivers beyond Ethiopia, the lands beyond Ethiopia. And you know, that huge African continent. And so these rivers are back down into that area. In the ancient times, it's believed, in looking at the chronologies and all in the scriptures, that they were the descendants of Cush. And so sometimes Ethiopia is called the land of Cush in the Bible. And the first time we read about Ethiopia is in the Garden of Eden, in Genesis chapter 2. It's talking about the rivers that flow from the Garden of Eden. Now, I don't understand the geography of the antediluvian world. The great flood that came upon this world, when the fountains of the deep were opened up, it's as though it rearranged the whole world. And some of the names stay the same, but the geography is all different. But it describes the Garden of Eden as though you're on top of the world here. And the rivers that flow out of the springs of the Garden of Eden, well, they flow into all the world. And it talks about this river Gihon, the same it is that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. And so Ethiopia is a far distant part of the world somewhere, isn't it? We also get that impression when we come to the book of Esther. And we read about Ahasuerus the king that reigned from India to Ethiopia. In other words, as far east and west as you can get. But instead of the west pointing to Europe, he points south, down to the southwest, down through Africa. So it's a very remote part of the world to those who are of Israel, and thinking about where their perspective was. Now here it is in Genesis 10, 6 through 7. The sons of Ham, the sons of Cush, and then there is Put. And you read about Ramah and then Sheba. You see Sheba in that genealogy? Some of these names are going to be place names that later show up. It's originally the names of people, but they're going to come up as place names. And so in Isaiah 11 and verse 1, and I'll return to this later in the lesson, but in Isaiah 11 verse 1 it says, "It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people which are left." And where is he recovering them from? Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, and Cush. Well, that's another name for Ethiopia. In Elam, and Shinar, and Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. Well, that'd be the Greek islands, the islands of the Greeks out there in the Aegean seas. And so he's broadening them from all over the world, and among that he mentions Cush. Okay, we're going to pull all this together here before the lesson's over. In Jeremiah 13:23, there's an allusion to the appearance of the Ethiopian. They're the dark-skinned peoples of the world. And so it sounds like it's not just limited to that particular country up the Nile, but maybe on down throughout Africa. Just sort of classify them all together as the Ethiopians. Jeremiah says, can the Ethiopian change his skin? Or the leopard his spots? But in our text, he's talking about the hardships those people have endured. They've had a tough life in Africa. It's a people scattered and peeled, from a people terrible from their beginnings hitherto, a nation meted out, trodden underfoot, whose land the rivers have spoiled. So it was a difficult existence they had way up the Nile River. Here's some Ethiopians we read about in the Bible. Did you know that Moses married an Ethiopian? Now he had a wife, Zipporah. And you read the text and it is not clear just who this Ethiopian is. Is it his wife, Zipporah? Or did she die and he marry again after she died? And the text doesn't explain that to us, but it was a marriage God approved. Miriam, Moses' sister, did not like the fact that Moses had married an Ethiopian. And she raised such a fuss about it, God smote Miriam with leprosy. And Moses interceded on her behalf so that for a time she had the leprosy, but the leprosy was removed from her and she was able to come back within the camp. We read about the Queen of Sheba. You remember reading that name and that genealogy in 10, Sheba? Sheba is a place. It was a person, but it became a place. Where is Sheba? And we don't exactly know. There's some that would locate Sheba in the Arabian desert across the Red Sea from Africa, but others said, no, it was in Ethiopia. That's where Sheba was. And the Ethiopians, in their cultural history, trace their origin of their culture back to the time when the Queen of Sheba came and visited Solomon. When she left seeing the glory of Solomon and his kingdom, she returned unto Sheba saying that the half hath not been told. We read about the rescue of Jeremiah. These are after the days of Isaiah, but Jeremiah was a prophet, and because of what he prophesied, they were so angry at Jeremiah, they threw him in a pit. It was a pit with mire, somewhere down under the city of Jerusalem. Sounds to me like they threw him in a sewer. And he's sinking in the mire, and he's going to die down there. And an Ethiopian named Ebed-Melech came to the king on behalf of Jeremiah and interceded for the king and says, we need to save Jeremiah from that pit. And so what they did, they got it was such a nasty place, they got some old filthy rags and cloths and tied them together to make a rope and let it down to Jeremiah. Said, now put this under your arms and we'll pull you up out of that pit. And they pulled Jeremiah up out of that pit because of the intercession of Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian. We read about 2 kings of Ethiopia. One of them came up and was coming through Israel. Was he have some conquest to conquer the world or something? We don't really know, but his name was Zeresh. And he came up against Asa in Jerusalem, the great-grandson of David. And Asa, seeing this large Ethiopian army coming through Israel, asked the Lord for help. And with the Lord's help, Asa was able to defeat Zeresh and his army and send them back into Africa. And then later we read in Isaiah's day about Sennacherib. He is the mighty Assyrian. And he had come through the land and he came up and he besieged Jerusalem. And he was waiting to starve those people out. And while he had besieged Jerusalem, the rumor came to him that Trihaka, that's a king of Ethiopia and his army, was coming up through the land, and so it made it urgent for them, besieging Jerusalem, to surrender, because he thought he had another force on his way. As far as we know, it was only a rumor. But we know Sennacherib, and we'll get into that study later about Sennacherib was unsuccessful in taking Jerusalem at that time. Now that makes me wonder if maybe because that was contemporary with Isaiah and what was occurring then, because that would have been part of the reason he mentions Ethiopia in Isaiah 18. Knowing that history of Ethiopia now, let's look at this prophecy. Woe to the land shadowing with wings. I have to admit that when I read that, I must have misunderstood it. I thought of the wetlands and all the birds that would be across those wetlands, all the waterfowl across there. Maybe because I'd been down in the Everglades and seen that. But there's another kind of winged creature that's not so pleasant, and that's the insects. And the commentators are almost universal that this is the mosquitoes and the tsetse flies and the moths and all the insects that are all down there in that part of the land. It doesn't sound very pleasant that way, does it? The land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. Sounds far off, doesn't it? And that sendeth ambassadors by the sea. Well, why would Ethiopia be sending ambassadors out, going down the Nile River to other nations and countries? What is going on? And so that suggestion here is, with the shadowing of the wings and the sending of ambassadors, that there's something troubling the Ethiopians. They're going here in vessels of bulrushes upon the waters. You remember Moses was saved in a little vessel made out of bulrushes by his mother, protecting him from Herod, and hidden among the bulrushes. And they would make little boats out of this grass. It sounds like fragile little craft, doesn't it? It sounds that way. Did you know that some men went to the Nile and harvested bulrushes and built a craft that they sailed out of the Nile River, across the Mediterranean Sea, and all the way over to South America? They did that to prove it could be done. It was an idea, could we tie the Aztec temples that they have in South America to the pyramids of Egypt? Could there have been some kind of communication? And they showed it could be done. So they may not have been so fragile as they seem. But it does give us an image of what that country must have been like. All the insects, all the bulrushes. And then this, go ye swift messengers. And I want you to consider this, that he's saying not to those in the vessels of bulrushes, except maybe, go back. Go back to Ethiopia. You don't have to send ambassadors to the land. Go back to this nation, scattered and peeled, a people terrible from their beginnings hitherto, a nation meted out and trodden down, whose lands the rivers have spoiled. Why go back there? What's the cause of all this trouble? The big turmoil in the world in Isaiah's day was Assyria. This idea the Assyrians are coming, and so there's all this trouble in the land. Now you send them back to Ethiopia, and here's what I want you to tell them. Yeah, those Assyrians are on the march, but look, ye inhabitants of the world and dwellers of the earth, see ye and hear ye. See ye when he lifted up an ensign on the mountains. Well, now, that's how you do when you have an announcement to make. It's like, well, we call it the breaking news today, don't we? Well, they didn't have the internet, the breaking news, and the phones going off and all like that. But what would they do? Well, in the high places, they'd raise a banner or an ensign. There's a message that everyone needs to hear. And then the blowing of the trumpet. Hear ye and see ye. God's got something to say. The Lord said to me, I'll take my rest. The world is in turmoil. It looks frightening to those of us on the earth. It's not in turmoil to God. I'm good with this. I can take my rest. God's still the master of what goes on this earth. Says, I'll take my rest and I'll consider my dwelling place. Now I want you to go back into Ethiopia and see this. A clear heat upon the herbs, like a cloud of dew in the heat of harvest. I had been to Ethiopia, but I've been there. We call them the dog days of summer, don't we? After the crops are laid by and you're just waiting for that crop to ripen, and what do we have? Heat and humidity bearing us down. And under that heat and humidity, that crop is getting prepared for its harvest. I says, I'm going to take my rest. All this is coming out just as I'd planned. And it's coming to fruition. But what the Assyrians have in mind, that's not going to come to fruition. Because before this harvest is ripe, I'm going to cut it off. For the harvest, when the bud is perfect and the sour grape is ripening in the flower, he'll take both the cutting of the sprigs with pruning hooks and take away and cut down the branches. He's going to leave them scattered all over the ground. All this fruit they'd have to harvest, what will it be? Well, the birds will summer over it. That's what they'll eat through the summer. Anything left of that, the wild beasts, they'll winter on it. It'll be their forage through the winter. I'm going to cut it off. It's not going to come to the harvest. Man's plans that are against my will are not going to occur. I'm going to take care of that. But then this. There's going to be a time to come. And in that time shall the present be brought unto the Lord of hosts. Now it talks about these people. Again, it's poetic, isn't it? When it talks about the Ethiopians. They're the people scattered and peeled and terrible from their beginning, and a nation meted out and trodden under, whose lands the rivers have spoiled. But these Ethiopians, to the place of the name of the Lord of hosts, the Mount Zion, they'll bring a present. Don't separate this from the story we're reading Isaiah. Go back to Isaiah chapter 2. When the mountain of the Lord's house will be established in the top of the mountains, and all the nations shall flow into it. And they'll say, let us go into Mount Zion and hear the word of the Lord. Well, now it's getting specific. That's what the Ethiopians are going to do. They'll come to that mountain. They'll bring that present. There's other prophecies like this in the Old Testament. We looked at one of them in Isaiah 11:11. It'll come to pass in that day, the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people. Part of them will come from Cush, Ethiopia. It says in Psalm 68 and verse 31, Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hand unto God. We read it in the prophet Zephaniah chapter 3 and verse 10. Again, from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. That's way down from Africa now. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my supplicants, even the daughter of my dispersed, shall bring mine offering. There's that present. Coming to Mount Zion. Coming to the Lord. What does it mean when the Ethiopians will come seeking after the Lord? Well, now remember, these prophets, they spake and they prophesied in poetry. And Jesus tells us that the words spoken by the prophets are being fulfilled in Him, in His gospel, and in the New Testament. And sure enough, we come to the New Testament, we read about the Ethiopian coming to Jerusalem and hearing the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's in Acts chapter 8. The angel of the Lord spake unto Philip, saying, Arise, go toward the south unto the way that goeth down from Jerusalem unto Gaza, which is desert. And he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, and eunuch of great authority under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who had the charge of all her treasure and had come to Jerusalem for to worship, was returning and sitting in his chariot reading Isaiah the prophet. And the Spirit said unto Philip, Go near and join thyself to this chariot. And Philip ran thither to him and heard him read the prophet Isaiah and said, Understandest what thou readest? He said to me, How can I understand except some man guide me? And he desired Philip, he didn't come up and sit with him. The place of the scripture which he read was this: He was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and like a lamb dumb before his shearer, he opened not his mouth. In his humiliation, his judgment was taken away. Who shall declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth. And the Ethiopian answered Philip and said, I pray thee, of whom speaketh the prophet this? Of himself or of some other man? Then Philip opened his mouth and began at the same scripture and preached unto him Jesus. And as they went on their way, they came into a certain water, and the eunuch said, See, here is water. What doth hinder me from being baptized? And Philip said, If thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest. And he answered and said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And he commanded the chariot to stand still, and they both went down both into the water, both Philip and the eunuch, and he baptized him. And when they were come up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord called away Philip, but the eunuch saw him no more. And he went on his way rejoicing. He's going back to Ethiopia. He has the prophet Isaiah. He can study this prophet and he knows something about it now. He has something he can teach to his people when he gets back to Ethiopia. It's a mystery what happened to that man. We don't know. And how was he able to accomplish his work? We don't read that he had any spiritual gift or that he came in touch with the apostles. And there's some legends and tales about maybe an apostle later followed him down into Ethiopia and helped him, but the Bible speaks of none of those things. However, if you go to Ethiopia today, among those people, according to them, and this is just their tradition, that they can take you to a church that they have carved out of rock, and they tell them that the congregation that gathers together and meets in that church is the longest continuously existing congregation in the history of the world. And they say this began when that Ethiopian came back from Jerusalem and taught the gospel unto his people there in Ethiopia. Now that's not Bible, but that's in their cultural heritage, in their legend. And even though everything sometime about a tradition may not be so, there's elements of truth in there, aren't there? And so there's a people in Ethiopia to this day that claim they have the longest and most distant connection to that New Testament church we read about in the Bible. Here's something we learn from all of this. To me, it's fascinating and it's interesting, and the very way it's told is in language that is beautiful. It brings images to the mind. But there's something else here. It's very practical and real for us. Jesus said in Matthew 28:19 and Mark 16:15, Go preach the gospel to all the nations, to all the world, to every creature. Well, I borrow the language from Esther 1:1. That'd be from India to Ethiopia, wouldn't it? Every place you can go, that gospel has an application. And to us, India seems so far away and far, and then Ethiopia seems so distant from us and strange, but the gospel's to go there. Isaiah 18:1 and Zephaniah 3:10, beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. That's like from Ethiopia and beyond. And think about that huge continent of Africa. and all the peoples that dwell down there, all the way down to the Cape. And they're to hear the gospel. In Acts chapter 1 and verse 8, Jesus said they'd preach the gospel to the uttermost parts of the earth. I want you to imagine you're there in Jerusalem now, and Jesus talks about the uttermost parts of the earth. And in that first century in Jerusalem, where would the uttermost parts of the earth be? Well, among the things you would be thinking about was, well, that'd include Ethiopia, wouldn't it? But if Ethiopia was the uttermost parts of the earth then, what about Warren County, Tennessee? I mean, think how far distant that was. And look where the gospel has gone into all the world. It has even come over here to Warren County, Tennessee. Why, even the Ethiopians would have thought this was the uttermost part of the earth in those days, if they had even knowledge of an area or a people here. And here we are. And we're hearing that same gospel. The gospel of Jesus Christ in the church of Christ is big enough for everybody in the world. It's not just a piece of southern mountain culture. No, get that out of your mind. No, this is what has been prepared from the foundation of the earth, and it's to go into all the world. And we need to be part of that message of getting it into all the world. Everybody in this world needs to be baptized into Christ and added to His church. And that means me. And that means you. So from these distant, obscure prophecies told in this beautiful language, there's an important message for us. We need to have the simple trust, faith, and understanding of that Ethiopian. Well, here's water. What does hinder me from being baptized? And confess the name of Christ and be baptized. Live as a citizen of His worldwide kingdom. So, if you want to respond to that message this morning, you have an opportunity as we stand and sing this invitation song.